see some familiar faces and some new faces here tonight. My name is Leslie Hubbard. I am Program Manager for Climate and Sustainability at the Salata Institute. And I am so excited that we're launching this series this whole year on careers in climate action. Today's focus is on careers in climate and energy, and we have a great panel here I'm really excited to introduce. So I'm going to start first with Nancy Israel. So she's over here on my right. Nancy handles groundbreaking regulatory cases on climate change as a clean energy lawyer at the electric utility National Grid. Through advocacy and collaboration with counterpart utilities, regulators, renewable energy developers, and clean energy advocates, Nancy works on implementing public policies to transform the electric grid for a clean energy future. Nancy's current focus is a first-in-nation case on forward-looking electric system planning to connect the solar energy, energy storage, EVs, and electric heat pumps needed for the state to reach its net zero 2050 goals. Nancy pivoted to a regulatory clean energy practice after spending most of her career as a business and reinsurance lawyer. Previous positions include being an international counsel and partner in EV, in-house counsel for Harvard University, and positions in every size law firm, including her own. Nancy also worked in clean energy advocacy at the nonprofit Ceres and was on the New England Board of Directors of E2, a national nonpartisan group of business leaders and investors advocating for policies that are good for both the economy and the environment. And she is a graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Law School and is a member of the Adams House Senior Common Room. So welcome, Nancy.
Thank you.
Next to Nancy is Jorge, who is a partner at Willkie, Farr, and Gallager in the Corporate and Financial Service Department, also co-chair of the Project Finance and Investment Practice Group and a member of the Latin America Practice Group. Mr. Kamine focuses his practice on a wide range of transactions in the energy and infrastructure sector globally, with a particular emphasis on the debt and equity financing of projects and the structuring, acquisition, and divestment of investments in a broad array of energy and infrastructure projects and assets. He has broad experience across the energy industry, including specific experience with renewable and conventional power and transmission, LNG, hydrogen, and biofuels, and with public-private partnerships and investments in transportation and other non-energy infrastructure. His geographic experience includes work on matters in over 25 countries throughout the world, with significant experience handling matters in transactions across the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. He is fluent in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and regularly negotiates in these languages as well. He's also ranked in the Chambers USA and Global Guides for his work on projects in the energy sector. He's also been named to LatinVex's top 100 lawyers for Latin America and in the Legal 500 Private Practice Power List of U.S. and Mexico, and recognized by Latin Lawyer 250 Best Lawyers and the Legal 500 Latin America for his project finance, energy, and infrastructure sector work. He is also a graduate of Harvard Law School and has a BA from Rice University. So welcome so much, Jorge. Thank you. Next is Francesa Reznik. Francesa is a program associate for energy and mitigation policy at the Aspen Institute's Energy and Environment program. In this role, Francesa assists in the planning and execution of high-level forums on a variety of topics, bringing together experts from both the private and public sectors to discuss the biggest issues facing us today. Prior to joining this team, she worked at All In Energy, an energy justice nonprofit in Massachusetts. She's a two-time University of Pennsylvania alum. She holds a BA in Religious Studies and a master's degree in Behavioral Science, two unique perspectives which she brings to her climate work. She is also currently pursuing a Master of Theological Studies focusing on religion, ethics, and politics here at Harvard Divinity School. And she believes in aligning peoples of faith with the existential threat of climate change and tries to embody this ethic in her own life. Additionally, she was born in Mexico, raised in New Jersey, and now lives in Boston. So welcome. And please join me in welcoming Dan Weeks. Dan Weeks is Vice President at Revision Energy, an employee-owned B Corporation working to build our just and equitable electric future in New England. Together with his 500 co-owners, Dan seeks to use business as a force for good by deploying solar energy, energy storage, EV charging, and thermal solutions to combat the climate crisis. Prior to Revision Energy, Dan was executive director of Open Democracy, a nonprofit focused on government accountability and reform. And in 2002 to 2013, he traveled the United States by a Greyhound bus on a poverty line budget of $16 a day, researching poverty and political exclusion on a fellowship from the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. He's the author of Democracy in Poverty, A View from Below, and has written for The Atlantic, New York Times, Boston Globe, Christian Science Monitor, and other outlets. Dan also earned his BA in Political Science and International Studies from Yale and his Master's of Philosophy in Political Theory from Oxford. He was fortunate to live and work on 4 continents before returning to New Hampshire with his wife, who's a human rights lawyer from South Africa. And they live in Nashua with 3 children. So, welcome. And last but not least, it's a pleasure to introduce Esther Tamara, who is our moderator today. Esther is a Master of Public Policy candidate at Harvard Kennedy School. She's from Indonesia, focusing on business and government policy. She was also awarded the Roy Family Fellowship by Harvard's Belfer Center. And Esther is dedicated to solving climate and energy issues through market strategies and public-private collaborations. She was formerly the inaugural director at the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, and she played a key role in integrating climate action into policy discussions and promoting the net zero agenda in Indonesia. And Esther initiated the Indonesia Net Zero Summit, which is a leading climate conference that draws over 10,000 participants and brings together 200 plus organizations towards achieving a net zero Indonesia by 2050. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you so much to our panelist and moderator, and I'll turn it over to you, Esther.
Thank you so much. And that was Leslie Hubbard, the program manager at Salata Institute. Please give a round of applause for her. I'm very, very happy to be here tonight because you've just heard we've had a stellar panel here with us. And thank you so much also for making the time to just join us today. And before we dive into more of the energy issues and the climate issues, I'd love to just introduce our panelists more on a personal level. We do title this series The Career in Climate Action. So we'd love to hear more about your professional development, your career trajectory, and what led you to choose this career path. So perhaps we can start with you first, Nancy.
Yes, so I've had a checkered career as a lawyer, as you heard, and I started. For any of you who are lawyers, you may not, but I've been in very many areas of the law, as well as very many places to practice law. Every size law firm, as you heard, and 3 in-house counsel positions, so represent the companies that I work for in 3 industries that if you had ever told me I would work in, I would have fallen down laughing or run away screaming at the thought of it. The accounting industry, where I was the international counsel of Ernst & Young. There's now the utility industry, and I spent, I worked for Harvard in-house, so I don't count that in the same thing, but I spent a lot of my career also working with the insurance industry. So that's enough for any cocktail party for anyone to say, I have to get a drink, thank you. But it gave me a lot of fun and interesting experiences and different perspectives. I knew I wanted to get involved with climate change in some fashion well before I did, and I was telling Leslie, I think, when one of my clients, who was the general counsel of a big reinsurance company, which is basically the insurers of the insurers, catastrophe insurance, storm insurance, started talking about weather risk before climate change was spoken about commonly. And when he started to explain the risks and what was coming, I thought, I have to do something about that. But I was not at a place to disrupt my career to try something new. But I got to the point in my law practice where I was then in my own firm, and my practice was basically outside general counsel for small companies, so a whole wide range of legal issues, and then the insurance and reinsurance work. And I could see I was getting to the point where I would actually have to market, which I had been fortunate not to have to do before, but also think about where I was in my career and what I wanted to do. And I wanted to start working on climate change, which is not so easy to change direction in the law when you are as far along as I was. So I looked for ways to do it, and first I worked for Ceres, which is a nonprofit in Boston. If you know it, yeah. So our climate advocacy side, actually working on their insurance program and also their investor program. And then after that, I did it for about, over a year, and then consulted with them for about a year. But I got involved with NRDC, National Resource Defense Council, you know that. So they have, it's not a formal arm, but they call it E2, Environmental Entrepreneurs. So that was the business group, and I got very involved with them on their New England Board of Directors to the point people thought I was an employee. But it was a really interesting way to learn about it. But it was clear, and I'm sorry, I don't want to take so much time, but it was clear to me that my interest, probably as a lawyer, and we're less aligned with clean energy advocacy than if I could say, what's the fact behind this, but everybody was pointing at the utilities in the state, they're the big bad utilities, and I'm thinking that I enjoy nuance. This has to be more nuanced, and also that's where things really have to change. And that's, I knew somebody working at one of the utilities who I actually went to. I first thought I'd work for government, but as I was talking to her, she said, well, would you be interested in working at National Grid? I said, yeah, I would, and that's how I got started. And the day after I started, I had not been a regulatory lawyer before, although I had a litigation background. The day after I started, the first kind of, one of the first big new cases or dockets in Massachusetts hit, and they handed it to me. It had to do with solar and net metering and energy storage, and that was it.
Yeah, and we'd love to get into that a little bit later. And what about you, Jorge? You're also a Harvard Law School graduate. How did you get into this?
Well, so I love hearing your story, Nancy, because I wonder how many of us follow a similar trajectory of not necessarily in hindsight expecting we would be where we are in terms of the industries or the focus. And that's certainly true for me. I thought I would be in New York doing finance work when I graduated from law school, but I ended up, for personal reasons, starting my career in Houston. And as often happens to a lot of us, graduated with a lot of debt, and so I needed to take a job, certainly that was going to help me pay that debt off. I also, though more importantly, I think, wanted to develop some skills around commercial and business law. I knew I was really interested in international development. I was really interested in international relations. I was really interested in business. I had these sort of general interests. I wasn't quite sure how to navigate them, but that it in a way helped that I started in Houston, where the dominant industry is energy. This is in the late 90s. And in a sense, it was more my kind of following the current of, no pun intended, of the water current of what I was doing. And so I started with firms. I was with two firms there, and I was thinking a lot about your question coming over, and I guess I would say I think what really helped me was not so much having a great plan, although maybe that would have helped, but it was really trying to focus on getting skills, right? And I think for lawyers, I've had this conversation with non-lawyers who've been accomplished in their careers, and they'll say, you really have to be an expert. You really have to have this depth, right? And I think that's true for lawyers, and we're lucky because we have this, sort of career being a lawyer, and there's certain expectations and certain functions that we perform, so we kind of know what we're supposed to be doing, right? So that's helpful rather than just needing to discover the path. But we also have to have breadth, which is, at times there's a tension there. It's nice to have, but at times, and I think, Nancy, your career certainly distinguishes how to do that well, to be able to not just, be an expert in a very narrow area, but at the same time be aware of all these other things that are going on around you. Mm-hmm. And I would say, from my perspective, I guess the coherent point from all that was really skills. How do I negotiate? How do I draft? How do I understand, for what I do as a business lawyer, I always sort of think of it as like everyone comes into a room and they believe that there is something that they will create that's value enhancing for everyone, as opposed to other areas of law where it may be very zero sum. And so as a result, I sort of view it as my responsibility. I mean, I have my client, but collectively we all start from the premise of we all want to do whatever this is. Like we all want to try to get to that value enhancing outcome, and my role is to figure out with my client, obviously find out, is it really what we thought it was, but then really craft it and figure out how do we get from this point of concept to entering into whatever it is. And so kind of developing the skills to do that. And I don't want to go on too long, but I think that the thing I would say that may be helpful, so in my, Leslie was very kind, she sort of read my bio, which is on the website, which I should caveat is very focused on like the outgoing, like hire me as your lawyer kind of thing, and I should probably tailor it in perhaps a more interesting way, because one thing that maybe got lost in there is that I worked at the World Bank for 2 years. So I started 7 years at a law firm. I learned a lot about the energy industry. At some point it'd be interesting, and Nancy, you and I might have an interesting story to tell just about how the so-called energy industry has changed. Right. It's changed so much from like where I started and what I thought I would be, what I was doing initially. But when I got to the World Bank, that was a huge change. I was on the public side of the World Bank, so dealing with public institutions, with ministries, and that whole side, very different than my private sector practice. So I had a lot to learn, but at the same time I came with those three skills. Like, well, I knew I'd been doing it for 7 years. I knew how to negotiate. Maybe the context was different, but I knew I had that skill. I knew how to write in the legal context. I knew how to draft documents. And hopefully I knew how to listen to the clients, listen to the other parties, and think about where, what everybody thought was a hopefully value enhancing outcome. How do we get there? And then, there's all the other things you have in your question that we'll get to around risk identification and mitigation. So I would say what helped me was really having those skills that I felt gave me depth, allowed me some breadth, and were transferable. Because I was able to go from that one context to the next one, and then I went back to a law firm. But I'll pause there. I mean, there are other sort of great opportunities I've had to get involved in policy, get involved in development on a pro bono basis beyond the work I did at the World Bank. But I'll pause there. But that point at least I wanted to get across for what that's worth.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing of enough, I guess, to get us intrigued for the next round of questions later. Francesca, you're a program associate at a think tank, Aspen Institute, but you're also, taking a Master of Theology.
Yes.
That's a very interesting niche. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think it's definitely helpful to explain my path because it seems a little confusing. I also think that, as you can tell, I'm definitely a much more early career professional as compared to my fellow panelists. So maybe my experience will be informative to some people in the room who I might be closer in age to. I got my bachelor's in religious studies, as Leslie said. I graduated in 2019. I declared religious studies 4 weeks in. I set the record at my institution, and I don't think anyone else will ever break that record because that's not a normal thing to do. So I was very adamant about studying religion, and my mentor had gone to Harvard Divinity School, and I very much felt that my path was to also go to divinity school. But a lot of people in my life were concerned that having 2 degrees in religion would essentially make me unmarketable professionally. So I decided to stay at Penn for an extra year and do this really amazing interdisciplinary master's program with a very long title that was Masters of Behavioral and Decision Sciences with a concentration in public policy. And it would allow me to take all of the things that I had not been able to take as an undergrad when I was only doing religion and politics and literature. So I was able to take economics classes and statistics classes and learn how to code. And I felt that I would graduate and be very well-rounded. I still didn't know what I wanted to do. But during this master's program, I took an energy policy course as one of my electives, and I was absolutely fascinated with it. I'd always been interested in climate change, and what I realized from taking this course was, as much as I cared about biodiversity and preserving the rainforest, nothing mattered if we didn't stop burning carbon. And if I was going to join the climate movement, the only part of the climate movement that made sense to me was energy. And so I went up to my professor and I was like, I've had a light bulb moment and I think I want to go into energy. And he said, you have a bachelor's in religious studies, so I don't think you should do that. And I was very disappointed, and I just continued on with my path, and I applied to divinity school, and I accepted my acceptance to divinity school the first week of March 2020. So 2 weeks later, everything was different. And by the time it was the fall and time to come to divinity school was online. And so something that they did to convince us to not defer was to allow us to go part-time. So I went part-time and I decided to get a job. And at this point in time, I had decided that I was going to work in climate no matter what. And I applied to every single climate and environmental firm in all of New England. It took me 6 months to get a job. It was also a global recession, so, you know. And I started working at All in Energy, and it was a nonprofit. It was focused on energy justice. We were actually in the community implementing the policy, which I think was the best way to start my career now that I'm high level and trying to craft policy and I'm dealing with federal policymakers and state policymakers, having had the experience of actually knocking on doors, working in farmers markets, talking to people on the ground. I think it was incredibly informative. I speak Spanish fluently. 97% of people at All in Energy were bilingual. It was an amazing place to get my career started. But I always knew that I wanted to pivot into something that was more policy oriented, and that's how I ended up at the Aspen Institute. Unlike other think tanks that you might be familiar with, like Brookings or Atlantic Counsel, we are not professional intellectuals that the end product is not our policy. We are professional conveners. Our end product is the events that we put on. Because of the fact that we are nonpartisan and non-ideological, we are able to inhabit a super unique space in DC, which is that we are very well respected and people will come to our table who might not go to other people's tables. And so we are able to create dialogue following Chatham House rules. So it's not for attribution. We don't always publish participants lists. We often do. We don't necessarily put out reports about every conversation that we have. A lot of the conversations that we are having are about planting seeds. And if you plant hundreds of seeds every year, some of those will bear fruit. And we can point to pieces of policy that we have put out that made it into bills, but we would never take credit for it. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to create a different way of thinking about what is possible. And our only two rules are you believe climate change is real and you believe that it was caused by humans. If you believe those two things, you are welcome to sit at our table. And so we create really, really interesting, productive conversations, productive being the key word because you're not getting a lot of that in DC, and we can make that happen. So an amazing job. The Aspen Institute is an amazing place. I'm in the energy and environment program specifically. Some of you might have heard of our Future Leaders program at Aspen Ideas Climate. That's not my team. I'm on energy and mitigation policy, but that's under my program umbrella. Happy to talk to anyone about that afterwards, but yeah.
Thank you, Francesca. And I think what I'm hearing from you is that there's this thread that connects all of your professional journey, which is this like community-centric approach. And there's a lot of, conversation about the energy justice, for example. What does that look like? And I'd love to get your thoughts on that a little bit later. But for now, I really want Dan to just speak a little bit to us about your work. You have a master in philosophy and you did a lot of like democracy work in the past. So how did you get into energy?
Yeah, good question. And I still scratch my head sometimes, but it's great to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining us and an honor to be on this panel. I'll start by confessing that I'm an unlikely business guy, even more so at a construction company. Definitely just not what I envisioned several years ago. I'd like to say I got my start in solar kind of accidentally in high school. I was at some random public high school in New Hampshire where I grew up, and this company out of Texas called Enron was spreading their money around to try to buy a good name before everything went downhill. And if anybody's 35 or older, you'll know what I'm talking about. So they sponsored a solar car team at our high school and got to dabble in solar in the late 90s when it was still more theoretical than real. Dreamed that maybe someday I'd power a home or maybe even my car in that way, but it certainly felt pretty far off. My first true passion in those years was, strange as it sounds, democracy, and got inspired by an old lady known as Granny D, Doris Haddock, who at the age of 90 had walked across America for campaign finance reform. What a random thing, but amazing. And she happened to live in the town next door, and she spoke at my high school and got me fired up. And that became my passion. And after a gap year with AmeriCorps in DC, I started undergrad and had the great timing to start there in Connecticut at the same time that the governor of Connecticut was being jailed for corruption. So got to spend those next 4 years kind of more focused on state politics and local politics than my classes sometimes, and helped with a bunch of other students and more seasoned activists to push through the first legislature-approved public funding law for campaigns in the country. And that was my passion, and figured I'd keep doing that until we had solved money in politics, which I knew would take a little while. Lord only knows it's a long fight, and it's gotten a lot worse with Citizens United and other Supreme Court rulings. But life has unexpected twists and turns, and a friend of mine told me the summer before senior year that I ought to at least apply for a scholarship for grad school, and was in the crapshoot that it is oftentimes. Was lucky enough to get a scholarship to go over to Oxford. Was not part of the plan. I was going to just go become a full-time activist and fix democracy, and all would be well. But I figured there was probably some reason to go on to grad school, having been that fortunate, and so wanted to keep studying democracy even as I was trying to practice it as an activist. And met my wife there from South Africa, which sent me on all sorts of new unanticipated directions, but continued that work both domestically, based out of New Hampshire and DC, and also abroad in South Africa. One of the conditions before I could convince her to move up to New Hampshire with me was that we lived a couple years in South Africa, which was so important for my own growth in myriad ways. One of the ways which set me off on that curious bus tour that was mentioned in the introduction, not 2002 to 13, but 12 to 13. It was not a decade-long Greyhound tour. In case anybody thinks I'm that badass, I'm not. But simply living in South Africa, I know some of you are from abroad. I'm sure many of you have spent time abroad, including in developing countries where poverty is a lot more in your face. Kind of gave me eyes to see in a much clearer way the human inequities and injustice that really underscored the need for real democracy. And after living there for that period and having folks in pretty desperate conditions knocking on our door, actually nobody can knock on your door in South Africa because there's high fences, gates, electric fencing and all that. It's the most income unequal country on earth, but knocking at the gate and asking for help kind of gave me eyes to see such inequities in my own country, and sent me on that peculiar journey and the research and writing that came out of that. But after continuing that work, returning to democracy, trying to do it with sort of a more grounded human lens in the subsequent years, and actually tossing my hat in the ring and running for state office in New Hampshire in 2016, not on the party of the guy who won nationally that year. So it was fun. Good try, no cigar. And after that turning point, we had just had twins that year. We're lucky to have a third now. And having stepped out of being an activist and tried to take it into the political realm as a candidate and failed, and Lord knows we've got a lot of work to do when it comes to democracy and money in politics. My wife was good enough to say, all right, take a breather, get acquainted with the twins. She's a professor, so could keep the lights on at home. And I spent a couple of months thinking as widely as I could about what am I meant to do with this next season of my life. And I think life is made up of a bunch of seasons. You don't need to know what comes next, but try to be true in the one in which you find yourself. And I realized that over all those years I'd been working on democracy, the issue number one, Exhibit A, I had always used to describe why we needed to get big money out of politics was the climate crisis. And it was because big oil and gas and coal were funding campaigns and lobbying like crazy that they were the ones effectively setting our energy policy for decade after decade after decade. And that was standing in the way of, now that I had 2 little kids at home, protecting the habitability of our only planet home. So I was lucky enough to connect with the co-founder of Revision, and this idea that I had that I would always be sort of a mission guy, never tainted by the private sector business. That was starting to turn as I learned about the B Corporation movement, certified B Corps, trying to use business as a force for good, kind of institutionalization of the triple bottom line concept, people and planet before profit. We would shortly make the transition as a company to 100% employee ownership, and the idea that equity in the social sense requires equity in the financial sense, and that we could equalize the creation and distribution of wealth, at least within our company. And to see, at the time I joined, we were just starting to build a commercial division. We'd been doing residential solar and complementary technologies for a while. And to see, as we built, going from about 100 people to about 500 today, with a real thriving commercial business and other technologies, to see how business can be a force for good has been a really exciting journey. So we can talk more about that later. But yeah, didn't expect to be here, but I sure feel just lucky as heck to be in this space, to be, like Francesca said, in the implementation space, helping to build this just and equitable electric future that we all need.
Thank you, Dan. And I think we all agree that we don't expect to be here tonight talking about energy. Me, myself, I was a foreign policy analyst before all of this. So I didn't know the first clue about what energy transition is up until like 3 years ago, right? So I'd love to get into the meat of the discussion right now. And I just want to tell everybody that we'll be opening up to questions later on. So please prepare your questions, anything from career tips to, about energy transition, climate, or whatever it is that you're interested in. I think I would love to get perhaps just a bird's eye view first from Jorge. Earlier Dan mentioned about, how do we build a just and equitable future, not only in the US, but also globally, right? There's always this global north and global south divide. And what I really loved about your experience is that you work across 25 countries. And, you oversee all of these financial transactions for energy infrastructure and energy investments. Can you please tell us, particularly as the chair of the Latin America practice, what are some of the renewable energy investments trend that is happening in the region? And when you go about structuring a public-private partnerships, what are some of the risk mitigation that you take into consideration there?
No, thank you for that. And honestly, I would just say, I think we've got such a great panel because I think there's a lot that's been said, and I'm looking forward to kind of stepping away from some of the private law firm piece also and touch a little bit on where I see intersections with what I've seen. The other thing I'll say is, and this is not an advert because I think it's behind a paywall, but so coincidentally, the chair of the Latin American practice and I wrote essentially a piece for a publication called LatinVex, where we were asked, it's a very simple Q&A format, a little bit about, what's your perspective for this year for energy and infrastructure in Latin America. And I think what I would probably start by saying is that I think a lot of, without wanting to suggest that we can overgeneralize and make every country and every context the same, there are a lot of lessons learned, and maybe a little bit like Dan, my experience working in the World Bank allowed me to understand the US and how policy works here in those interactions. So what I would say, to come back to your question, is globally, in particular in the global south, and this came up even many, many years ago when I was working on a pro bono effort looking at should we have an international green bank with a think tank, that the energy demand needs are different in the north than in the south. And that creates certain opportunities and it creates certain challenges. And the opportunity is that there is true demand in the south. Because economies are growing, or certainly we hope they are, and we want them to develop in a sustainable way, in a climate-friendly way. But that's important because although it started to change a little bit in countries like the US, for a long time when we were talking about this issue of what we now refer to as energy transition, because the nomenclature has changed, or evolved, I should say, it was always a question of a substitution. And that created a certain challenge in political economy, right? Because we would say, well, why are we going to pay more to move from fossil fuels to renewables, and that created a certain dynamic which we can talk about, right? Whereas when you look at Latin America, to take just one example in the global south, they need energy. And so it's, in my mind at least, much more of a discussion around the opportunity is there. As has happened, fortunately, there's an identification of the resources. So people recognize the resources are there, the resources that allow for renewable energy. And moreover, I think there's sort of a recognition that now as the costs have come down, that it's no longer a question of a trade-off, that it's necessarily fully cost prohibitive, which was the other debate that we had. So Latin America has resources, not only for itself, but with the potential to export both to others in the region and beyond, and it has the need. So great. Why am I pausing? Because that isn't necessarily the same as that's what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. That's what we would hope should happen. And I don't know how much you want me to kind of delve into the what needs to happen, but I would kind of in a nutshell, I would say some of it's technical, but I think fundamentally a lot of it has to do with the same issues we see everywhere, including the U.S., which is thinking about governance, thinking about participation of different communities, how communities who may be most impacted by particular projects are included in a process of decision making, and whether they have full and informed consent or not. And interestingly, as we go down this path, at least from my perspective, there's certain thematic issues that keep coming up. And what do I mean by that? So when I was here and I would go to the Kennedy School and soak in all of this great knowledge, as well as the law school, as well as the business school and everywhere else, we had a lot of discussion around extractive industries, right? And the discussion around informed consent, around communities, a lot of these themes, were always around the use of these extractive industries. The reality now, right, is when we talk about solar, utility scale solar, I think initially everyone said, well, this is obviously, a better alternative, from a sustainability standpoint. But now you have people asking the question whether it's because of the installation of the utility scale solar or wind or whatever technology, or the transmission lines, that's land use. And so in a way we're back to maybe having the discussion that's the core, right, which is how do we want to use land? Yeah. What's sustainable? How do we make these choices? And all of that, in my mind, comes back to what are the institutions that we have? Who makes those decisions? How does that all function? And I don't say this just because I went to the law school, but what's the legal regulatory framework? What's the enabling framework? What's how does the democracy? Is there a democracy? How does it work? So maybe going a little away from your question, but to me that's kind of the way I would focus my question or answer.
Sounds good. And I think I want to bring Nancy into this conversation as well. So Massachusetts have a net zero target of 2050, and National Grid is obviously one of the major stakeholder, I think, decision maker in achieving this goal. Touching on some of the aspects that the other panels have speak about, regulatory framework, and then community participation and all of that good stuff. Can you please share with us your perspective on how National Grid is actually helping assist Massachusetts in meeting that goal?
Yeah, and I'll speak, disclaimer, I'm a lawyer. I don't speak on behalf of National Grid. I'm speaking from my personal views. But National Grid and the other two electric utilities in Massachusetts, Eversource and Unitil, which has a much smaller footprint in Massachusetts, all are working collectively and individually to meet these targets. We are spurred along, I would say, by the statutes, the laws that Massachusetts passes. I mean, we're all fortunate to live here in Massachusetts, and the most every year one's come out for the last few years, but the most recent one that came out directed the electric utilities to create comprehensive plans for how they're going to plan their distribution system, the lines that go to your homes and businesses. But what changed from a regulatory perspective is up until this law, utilities basically had to look backwards. I mean, they couldn't build for the future and recover their costs for doing it. Now, and they couldn't take account of the state climate goals. Now we have a legislative mandate to do both of those things. Be forward-looking, build out for electrification, and assist in achieving the state's short-term, like the 2030, and interim to 2050 climate goals. So that's a whole new way of thinking for utilities and working with stakeholders. And so I mean, I won't speak about in detail at all about the case, but so what's consuming me these days mainly is this plan. It's on a very short timeline. Our main regulator is the Department of Public Utilities. Except in rare cases, they don't have a deadline for issuing a decision. They basically had 7 months from when when we filed we had to file draft plans at the beginning of September. We had to file our final plans at the end of January, and the Department of Public Utilities has to issue its decision on these plans at the end of August. That is incredibly compressed given the scope. Stakeholder engagement is mandatory by statute, and so there are a lot of parties involved and a lot of issues involved and a lot of first anywhere things involved. So
yeah, and you just mentioned that there's a lot of stakeholder engagement involved. I'm pretty sure all of us here in the room who are interested to pursue career in this space know that, we're going to have to do a lot of that, and making sure that everyone's still aligned on this, I guess, Net Zero 2050 target for Massachusetts. Can you speak to us a little bit about how do you manage that navigation on a day-to-day basis?
So to build on what Jorge said and Dan said, so I represent my client, but we all have a shared goal, and we have different perspectives on how to get there. And we have equity also is now mandatory to take into consideration. So that's another big one. So while it's not on us to manage the process, we do have to manage ourselves to engage in ways that may not be that comfortable, and to not be on the defensive. And I think the company tries to do that. Certainly work with its customers. I mean, it's there to serve its customers. Yeah. So whether they're developers of solar or energy storage or whatever, but also communities that want to have a say about where does the utility build something. They have engineering constraints and all kinds of constraints on where things can go. So it's not just, you mentioned, we also have siting and permitting, land use. Yep. So even environmental groups that might be in favor of clean energy might also be opposed to actually putting any infrastructure there, and we need to build the infrastructure to be able to get to the next stage. So it's a process of listening, engaging, trying to reach agreement, rebutting, explaining, advocating, negotiating.
I'm sure it's tough. Dan and Francesca, I saw you nodding your head a lot. Would you like to weigh into the conversation as well?
I was just nodding my head at permitting. Permitting reform is everyone's favorite word in DC right now. We have a report that we did a couple years ago called Building Cleaner Faster. We've talked to members of the Hill several times trying to turn that into legislation. Someone recently told me at a forum that if we don't fix the interconnection queue and build all the transmission that we need to build, we're at risk of losing 80% of the emissions reductions in the IRA. So transmission reform and permitting reform are pretty much all I talk about every day. We can't do anything until we can build the things.
I'll just underscore that we have got to build so much faster than we're building today. I don't know if anybody walked outside today. It was 58 degrees in Cambridge. This is still February. I was recently looking at the data. Average winter temps are up over 6 degrees since I was a kid. The impacts are extraordinary, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, and we are not on track. We hit 1.5 degrees Celsius last year. Yes, it was El Nino. Hopefully that's not necessarily the new normal, but it probably is. So we know that there's a lot of different interventions needed to chip away at that 59 gigatons of global CO2 emissions annually, but it has to include a whole lot more infrastructure, which isn't going to take up, and I try to put this in perspective, here in Massachusetts, we won't need 1% of state land to get to that 100% goal. It's less than 1% of what we would need in a state that's roughly 65% wooded, and so you don't need to take down a lot of trees to get to where this state has committed to go. But that is still a lot of new infrastructure, and it does require those utility upgrades. I was looking at our interconnection queue earlier today. We have projects that should be getting through study to get approval, to be able to start building in 6 months that are taking 20 months and more, because the utilities, particularly north of the border, just aren't staffed up, don't have necessarily the competence, don't have the rules behind them. We don't even have interconnection rules in the state of New Hampshire like Massachusetts does. So there are a lot of really practical barriers. And without getting too far into the weeds, I mentioned that, and I'm glad others have too, because we need troubleshooting at every juncture in that line. We need smart people who are interested in the law, to whether it's through powerful advocacy groups like Ceres and, of course, Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, whether it's through, there's so many different players that need to be pulling together, yes, representing different stakeholders, and through a transparent process and a process that is open to engagement. It is a tension, a real tension we have to grapple with between meeting the mandate for democratic, equitable participation and protecting the habitability of our planet, and they don't need to be in conflict. We can do both, but we need really smart people engaged in pushing this boulder up the hill. So that's on the deployment side. It's certainly on the policy and regulatory side. It's in the NGO space, mobilizing communities whose voices have largely been excluded from the conversation. And if I didn't say deployment already, we got to just build.
So I want to be really mindful of time. So I think what I'll do right now is I'll just take questions straight from the audience. And then if I have some follow-up questions later, we can incorporate it to the conversation. So does anyone have any question they'd like to ask any of the speakers right now? Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. Meredith started. I'm a sustainability graduate student with the Extension School, and I'm not in the industry at all at the moment, though I did just do 2 solar installations on my own houses. I have a solar question and then a regulatory question, but the solar question is I know you mentioned like you'd have to take down a percentage of the forest. I've always been curious as to why we don't go after parking lots more. Like why? Like, is it because they're all privately owned? Is that the biggest barrier, or are there other structural barriers on the parking lot? And then, if you don't mind, I have a second question.
Amen to parking canopies. One of my main roles at Revision is leading our commercial team, and so we are selling wherever there's interest. On a quick side note, one of my personal missions is to convince more people, especially smart people like those in this room, to consider sales. Selling this stuff doesn't sell itself, even if it makes all the sense in the world. You need smart people who will embrace that line of business that has often been, to me, sales was a dirty word not that long ago, but to sell the stuff that needs to be sold to build the clean energy future takes real skill and real focus. So our sales team is very focused on carports, on rooftops. We want to build in the built environment whenever possible, however possible. At the same time, on a cost per watt basis, it's about twice as expensive to build a carport. There's a lot more structural steel. There's a lot more below grade work that's needed. The foundations are very considerable, tearing up existing parking lots, trenching, and all the rest. So we will not get there with the built environment alone, although we could get much further than we are. We could meet most of America's energy demand if we were to really optimize within the built environment, rooftops, carports, et cetera. To make those projects pencil, to make them financially viable, we need state policies. Mass has been a leader there. The SMART program, the current iteration of net metering, does provide additional incentive value for projects that are on rooftops, and more so for parking canopies. Also for landfills, capped landfills that are contaminated lands, and we have under the federal incentives a focus on brownfields, also disturbed and contaminated land. So that all makes a ton of sense. And at the same time, with, again, a fraction of 1% of our land, some of which is forested, most of which hopefully is not, and none of which should be sensitive ecosystems. Like, yes, we definitely try to always steer clear of wetlands and vernal pools and all the rest. But yes, parking canopies all the way.
Policy question on the SEC Scope 1 and 2 rule. I'd love the panelists' thoughts on, how hard is that going to get appealed? What do we see in the future for that? I know it's been a long time coming.
Would love to tackle that.
I don't have an answer. It's a little outside of my area specifically. But I should say I'm definitely here in my individual capacity. That was a good reminder that Nancy had.
Yeah, I no longer work in that area, so I have to say that it's not what I've been following. But
there's obviously going to be a lot of pushback. I'm the last thing from an expert there, but as a company, part of our goal is to tackle Scope 2 and Scope 3, and we do see other businesses who are making those commitments. Yes, there's naturally a lot of pushback, and that is achieving the kind of transformation of those supply chains is not an easy goal, but you need agencies like the SEC demanding it. So whether they'll be successful in this iteration, I don't know, but I'm really glad that they're drafting those rules and posing those questions, because we've got to demand more of large businesses and all the rest.
Yeah, I feel like that comment around finance being the fuel upon which it burns is a tipping point key.
Yeah, and I think I would love to just include also Francesca in this conversation. You focus a lot about, just climate justice and energy justice, and we've been hearing, various panelists talk about equity, the equity piece, and I was working in the international diplomacy field before, and what has been really monumental in the past 2 years is the increase of, say, financing aid packages like the Just Energy Transition Partnership, right? Mm-hmm. And that's going out to countries in Southeast Asia, to South Africa. Can you talk a little bit more about that? We've been focusing on domestic. I think I'd love to get more of an international perspective on that. And then after that, Jorge, if you want to also weigh in on that piece as well.
I'll let Jorge tackle the international perspective. I'm very domestically focused. I will say there was something both of you mentioned, which was about community-informed consent and all the things that we have to build. A lot of communities are going to be impacted by the things that we have to build. Not only the things that we have to build, the things that we have to mine. To hit our net zero goals, we're talking about a 6 times increase in the amount of minerals that we need globally. It's not only more minerals than are currently being mined, it's more mining than has ever occurred ever in the history of humanity. It's an insane increase in what we need in order to transition. And unfortunately, demand reduction and recycling aren't going to make that number get much smaller. We need the minerals. And you end up having to decide whether you're okay with the minerals coming from a 12-year-old in the Congo with no labor protections, or happening in the United States very often on indigenous land or near communities. So that's a difficult conversation, and it's one that we're going to have more and more. And one of the things I am most proud of in my work at the Aspen Institute is we released a critical minerals policy report, and in it we were the first think tank to ever publicly endorse free, prior, informed consent as an actual federal policy position. And not only did we endorse that, we were able to get prominent Republicans and Republican organizations to also co-sign their name to that. So that means that we could potentially actually get legislative support for enshrining free, prior, informed consent as something that companies have to do. FPIC is a big buzzword, but it means exactly what it says. If you're going to go in as a company into a community and you're going to build something or you're going to open a mine there, you need to get free, prior, informed consent from that community. And in that report, we also talk about profit sharing models and different ownership models, like Dan mentioned, that could be implemented in this transition, because the transition needs to be just. And also, a lot of these projects are being stopped by community members who have rightfully terrible perceptions of the mining industry, or often of utilities and other types of businesses that come into their communities and ruin everything. So how do we get from not in my backyard to yes in my backyard, because this is going to be economically beneficial to my community. It's going to allow me to play my part in helping the energy transition and helping stop climate change. And that's a huge lift to ask of a lot of these communities, especially ones that have been hurt in the past. So I think in terms of energy justice, for me, the answer is FPIC, both mining and building out transmission and new generation. But yeah.
Thank you. Jorge?
I was going to say I'm happy that Francesca saved me on FPIC, because I never quite get it right. But at the World Bank, that was important. ILO provision on that that ties into that. I thought you raised a lot of important issues that I think are as true internationally as they are in the U.S. I just think in the U.S. we've maybe thought about them slightly differently, and now I sort of see the way that we try to talk about them and discuss them starting to have some similarities. And I'll come back to your question, because I might ask you a little bit kind of how you're thinking about it. It's a sort of a very broad topic, but also I'm really interested in Dan's perspective, because for me, on the in the trenches on the deal side, when we talk, as I was alluding to projects in areas where there's going to be a community where, even if one can comfortably argue it's in the national interest, there may be one community that is being impacted more than others, and just trying to work through the FPIC issue and democracy and governance, and because I think, to take the perspective, as often happens in my line of work, where very often I'm representing someone in the private sector, and I have many clients who want to do the right thing, right? They want to, and they want to do the right thing for a variety of reasons. Some just objectively, also because it's good for their economics. They don't want to spend a lot of money in a large capital expenditure in an area where the community is ultimately going to be unhappy with that project. And then it may be a very unsuccessful project, either because they push back on it through the mechanisms that exist, or simply because it creates a reputational issue. And it was interesting, I was thinking, if we were talking about these projects globally, and we were talking about, for example, wind, I would think about Oaxaca in Mexico, where there was pushback and that had an impact. We could talk about Chile, and we could talk about the hydro projects. There are many other places in the world. And then there's the Osage Nation, who just won a case in the United States that against a major developer, where the argument was they didn't get the licensing to do the mineral rights exploration, because to build a wind farm, and you may know this even better than I do, but they had to actually dig below ground to do the foundation for the wind farm, for each of the turbines that sit on the pylon. And so now the question is, what happens now? And it's an interesting question in my mind as to, I don't know the details, like why did they not seek that permission? The public statements from the Osage Nation have been, had they asked, we support renewables, but they didn't ask. And there was clearly an issue of their consent and the implications. So I'm not quite touching on your question, but in terms of financing, you mean broadly, or?
Yeah, just broadly. For example, I'm curious if you can share, when you're going to invest in a developing nation, whether that's Latin America or somewhere in Asia. I'm from the region myself, right? There's a lot of, I guess, political uncertainty, much so, compared to what we have here in the U.S. How do you weigh in that risk when you're about to finance a deal or a project, especially also when you add that layer, if the community is also pushing back? How do you factor all of that in?
So let me answer it with another disclaimer, which is that, unlike Dan, whose company actually does the projects, I just advise the clients. And so, my perspective on this is somewhat derivative. And I think those who actually have to do the projects have a much more granular, insightful and informed view on these things as an advisor. I think that the things to say that may be obvious, but to me, maybe this is our Harvard Law School training. I'm always sort of going back to basics. And the basics are that the projects that we're talking about very generally, right, because there's a lot of differences in countries, host countries, in rules, and in the technology. But when we come down to it, what we're talking about is a very large expenditure, a large capital expenditure that someone is making, that the company is making, that has a lot of risk associated until it's completed. Because yeah, you're spending money, but it's just a bunch of cement and steel or fancy technology. It really has no value until not only is it complete, but it is fulfilling whatever the expectations are for delivery of what they're producing. So if they're producing electrons, who's buying those electrons? So it's a big expenditure with a lot of risk until you get it done and until you can start delivering and producing revenue. And so as a result, none of these projects, I remember someone mentioning this, I think it was in connection with Dubai ports, which I don't think anyone, and maybe you and I remember, Nancy, but there was a point at which the United States government was objecting to the acquisition of a port terminal in the U.S. And one of the comments that was made was, one of the things about infrastructure is you can't just pick up and take your toys and go home. Right? If you build this big wind farm or solar project or lithium mine, you can't suddenly decide 3 or 4 years in, well, this isn't working out, I'm going to leave. And so what does all that mean? It means that at inception, when I'm, as one of many advisors working with a client, we are all looking at exactly what you're describing. We're all looking to see this is a long-term investment, which just as an aside is one of the reasons why, maybe very biased and selfish on my part, I think kind of doing this work is really interesting to really understanding political economy and dynamics, because we're always having to think about the long term. And in a way, it's an interesting metric, right? Because there are a lot of companies that make very important investments, but I think if you're making an investment, and again, I say this just as a lawyer, in manufacturing, right? One year you may be manufacturing in one country, and then maybe the situation gets more costly. Maybe it becomes more costly because of the political or economic situation. Well, you'll just open another factory. And I don't want to minimize the costs involved, but I just think they're very different. You can't just say we spent, as in the case of one project I did in Peru, there were at least 10 years before anything was actually built. And then there were another 3 years of construction. And then there have been many more years of production to actually be able to repay the debt and make that project profitable for the company. So that's a very long time horizon, during which, when you look at these at different countries, you can sort of look at these projects and maybe say that's one measure of stability, right? One measure of how at least the private sector sort of views their ability to operate. So I didn't answer your question, but let me and only take another moment to say, I say all of that to say you have to be looking at what is the environment? What is the rule of law? What are the institutions? If things don't go well, because inevitably they're unforeseen things, setting aside changes in policy or governments, how are you going to resolve those issues? And once you identify those risks, and once you've evaluated them, are they real? Are they significant? How likely are they? Then you can get into a whole wide range of instruments, whether they're from third parties or your contracts or the government, to kind of work to mitigate them. And then it's sort of a bit of a circular process, right? Of going back and going, okay, well, how comfortable do we get with that? So anyway.
Thank you for that. We have about 15 minutes left until the event is over, so I would really love to turn it over to the audience if you have any questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm studying environmental science and public policy at college. First of all, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. Also, the diversity of the panel, really appreciate it. One question maybe more to Dan, Francesca. When some of us maybe in the room think about maybe potentially going to graduate school, what would you advise us to look out for a program? Because I think at the moment, a lot of people in the sustainability realm are struggling to find programs that are actually like teaching the skills that you need when you're then working in the field. So do you think that the programs that you did were actually beneficial for the stuff that you're doing? Did it like kind of broaden your horizons, or what would be your take on that?
My first program that I did in behavioral science was extremely helpful to what I do now. a Master of Theological Studies is tough to be directly applicable to the energy transition. However, my big caveat is I'm a huge believer in soft skills. And I think that the climate umbrella is big enough for all of us. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who come in with the really amazing technical skills don't have the people skills or the management skills that are necessary to move things forward. So you need everybody. And I think my humanities education has given me a lot of the skills that make me good at my job. Specifically divinity school, like if you are in a room with people who disagree with you on the big questions, like is there a God and what happens after you die, being in a room with a bunch of Republicans is so easy. So
I think that's a wonderful point, which I would just underscore all of it, including the last bit, in that we need all comers, we need all skill sets. We certainly need the hard technical skills, although frankly, most of what we need to do to get from here to a sustainable planet is not rocket science. We have the proven technologies that we need to scale. And that is where this diverse range of skill sets, for me, as I said at the top, never imagined being in business, much less construction business, but I have been able to kind of find a path and now lead a team that does a lot of sales, that does project finance, so that works with customers directly, that works with finance partners, that works with all of their many lawyers, that works with communities. The permitting journey is a long and winding road. That works with the utilities, that works with policymakers. So a lot of that came from, in my case, being kind of humanities adjacent, social sciences, having a bit of background in politics and government to help navigate the policy side and the regulatory side. But then just living as a nonprofit advocate activist guy, where I didn't think of it as sales, but every day I was trying to raise money for the nonprofit to keep our payroll going for the staff. I was trying to sell our ideas to the media, to policymakers, et cetera. So if that's your bias, there is definitely a place in climate and clean energy for you. If the hard technical skills are your interest, absolutely a place for you. If the legal and regulatory is your interest, totally place for you too. And I'd happily talk after with anybody kind of about how your individual path might lead you to a company like Revision or those with whom we work. The last thing I just have to say, I was on my high horse about sales. I would also say encourage even a room like this of incredibly educated folks who are maybe in grad school or contemplating grad school. That's great. But think about the trades as well. America needs at least 1 million more electricians than we have today if we're going to get from here to that sustainable future. And we've had folks who went from being an attorney to becoming an electrician. And at Revision, we have a 4-year apprenticeship program where you're paid a good living wage from day one. You get your 8,000 hours, you become a certified electrician, a licensed journeyperson electrician. You can build the projects, and then some folks go on to become commercial project managers and lead large teams building this infrastructure. So even in the most unexpected paths, for a couple generations we've been saying in this country, the only way to a good life is to college and grad school if you can, and a good white collar job of some sort. That can be a good life for sure, and a lot of us have experienced that, but there are a lot of other ways to the good life as well.
And I want to add one more practical piece of advice, since I'm currently in grad school, finally graduating in May after 4 years. I've never not been in school, so it'll be a nice experience to only work. A lot of these programs that exist are really starting to change their tune about interdisciplinary education. And so I would look at all of the programs that might be interesting to you and actually look at the nitty-gritty. So at the Divinity School, you can take up to 50% of your classes outside of the Divinity School. And that means everything: the law school, the medical school, the Kennedy School. So you might be graduating with that MTS but have taken, as I have, environmental economics classes. Also, there are a bunch of new cross-school dual degree programs, both within universities and outside of universities. I went to a mixer the other day where I met people who were getting their MPPs at the Kennedy School and their MBAs at MIT Sloan, which is a much more technical MBA than the one offered at Harvard, right? But at the Div School, there are people who are MTS, and then also at the Fletcher School at Tufts, which is a very different international policy program than the MPP at the Kennedy School. So there's all these new programs that exist that can really be tailored to like what you want out of your degree. And I would just definitely look into not just the traditional sustainability programs like Duke and Stanford and Yale. If you are looking at those, see what options you have to pair those degrees with something else, because there's a lot out there now that didn't exist before.
Can I just add one thing to agree with what you were saying, and just from the perspective of being out in the field, and Nancy and I talked about this, there just wasn't time to come back to it. All of this is changing constantly. And so to me, like one of my regrets, if you want to call it that, is that we didn't have this sort of level of interdisciplinary study that, and so we kind of learn as we go, but to be able to really draw on a real academic, not to say it's not important, but to have that foundational understanding of all these different areas to integrate, to allow you to be adaptable as things change, to me would be invaluable. So I'm glad to hear about those programs.
I can't help being the annoying Yaley in a room at Harvard and say the Yale School of, if I was going back to grad school today, it would probably be something between their School of Management and School for the Environment, formerly the Forestry School. Gus Beth out of there founded NRDC, a neat tradition of environmentalism down there. But you're seeing there, and other examples that Francesca just mentioned, a really high-level interdisciplinary focus on the diverse range of skills that we need, again, to meet the climate crisis.
But Dan, so just to show that some of us Harvard folks know what goes on at Yale, I think the program, I don't know how many people are familiar with the Yale School of Management. I think it's a wonderful program, but there is something unique. You can probably speak to it more than I can about the difference from here. I mean, that sort of public and kind of business combination, right?
Yeah, big public sector, and one of their, I think, three main tracks is the environment. So really trying to train business leaders who are deeply grounded in climate and other environmental issues, and able to focus. They've also done a lot with the B Corp community as well, so a very public interest and public benefit focus.
I'll give Yale some credit as well. They essentially founded the field of ecotheology, and they have an entire religion and ecology program. Harvard Divinity is currently interviewing for their first ever religion and ecology professor. We're about like 2 decades behind what Yale's been doing, so.
Great. Do you have any other questions? I think I saw some hand earlier. Oh, yes. Sorry.
I had a question. My name is Joey. I'm also a student studying environmental science public health policy. I guess I'm interested in how do you combat kind of the goals of the public sector for environmental, goals, net zero, with the more financial goals, let's say, of the private sector, and how do you guys manage, or what strategies are there in place to kind of work through that?
Well, I'll start on that. I mean, and as Jorge said, it can be good business. I mean, it's bad business. It's bad business to alienate everyone around you and not comply with mandates. But I think, and as Dan talked about, business, a force for doing good, and we've seen the tensions on how that plays out sometimes, and potential missteps when businesses try and do that, and it's not well received. But I don't think it's actually a tension. I think the real tension I see in Massachusetts now, and I think this is general, we really need to build out our electric infrastructure, as we said. But it's expensive. I mean, there's no way around it. We have to stop pretending there's not a big cost to complying with these public policy objectives. And then it's the question of who pays and how do you pay and what support do you give those least able to pay so they're not disproportionately bearing the burden. But and yes, the businesses, whether they're solar installers or utilities or something else, they also have to earn a profit so they can stay in business. So I I don't know that it's so much of a tension between the financial realities and the public policy objectives, but we're all dealing with the question of, when I hear people say we have to make it affordable, we can't. I mean, we have to stop pretending it's not affordable from any absolute terms when you look at dollar amounts, but it's imperative, it's essential, and then figuring out that pay piece. I know in Massachusetts, the Department of Public Utilities has just opened an affordability docket for the energy transition. I think it's fairly limited in scope, but it's a start to at least address the issues. Federal funding, state funding, local funding even for canopies on carports.
If I might, I might just pick up on what Nancy was saying and probably say the same thing, but maybe add some other perspectives on it. So I think the simple answer is, if it's a good profitable business, then it should happen, right? That's a simplistic one. So as costs have come down on the equipment for, say, solar, it's made it more compelling, right? But that's only part of the answer, right? So it doesn't need to be a trade-off, but the reality is that you've got a lot of different time horizons, and you may need to think about exactly as Nancy and my co-panelists have said, because I think that kind of what you're hearing are the parts that are critical and very complementary to the private sector side, which is who's paying for what. Which are the parts that you can actually turn into a for-profit business if one wanted to reduce it, right? Which are the things that will actually be profitable on their own, and which are the things that need some sort of support? And what does that support look like, and how long does it last? And are those the right things to support, and how do we decide? I mean, there are all these sort of policy decisions, and I'm not trying to suggest it. I say that as an invitation for those in the room, because those, again, as I think my co-panelists have said, those are issues that people need to tackle, whether it's civic engagement, right, civil society, or it's on the government side, or it's just in thinking from an Aspen Institute perspective side, who are the right people, what should we be doing, and why are we doing it? So unfortunately, it's a complicated answer, but it broadly, it's achievable. You have to get into the details to kind of see where the public sector's role is and where the private sector's role is, and make sure you're facilitating that.
And just throw in that it adds also another factor in the pace of the energy transition.
Right.
Dan, I'm looking at you because I think one of Revision's, pillar mission is also making sure that clean energy access is also affordable to a lot of communities. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's such a good and such a complex question. At a superficial level, when I run the levelized cost of energy, so what will be the unit cost per kilowatt hour of this solar farm or whatever over its 25-year warranty period and 40-plus year commercial lifespan, it smokes the competition. Low single digits is the levelized cost of energy when you factor in ongoing operations and maintenance. And that's with utility rates in the 15 to 25 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's a great deal. Cheapest form of power in human history is a well-installed solar array. Wind is a close second. However, we need to, over the next couple of decades, and not many more, I hope, than a couple, we need to replace every machine that is powered by combustion with a efficient electric machine. And that's, I don't know how many tens or hundreds of billions of machines in this country, and I'm talking about every machine, small and large, not just the big ones, our cars, but our thermal systems, our industrial processes, and on and on and on. That is the only way we will get to anywhere near 1.5, or hopefully not much more than 2 degrees Celsius. At the current pace trajectory we're on, we're going to blow past 2 degrees Celsius this century, and we know what the consequences will be. So we've spent over a century building the machines of today, which are primarily combustion powered. We need, in a few short decades, to replace those machines with efficient electric machinery. And that capital cost is in the many trillions of dollars. Mm-hmm. That is a particularly high hurdle for most of the rest of the world. We spend a lot of time in South Africa, where all my wife's family live. That country is still close to 90% coal-powered today, even though they have one of the best solar resources in the country. And that is in no small part because, as a still quite impoverished developing country, it will take many billions of US dollars to replace those coal generators with clean solar. So that is a massive political economy question for anybody interested in international development, economics, the law, of course, working with international institutions, getting the darn money that has been promised under the Loss and Damage Fund actually deployed. It's been years since we've been making those promises, more than a decade, and getting those promises within range of where they need to be, which is at least an order of magnitude greater than they are today. Huge, huge challenges. So more questions than answers, but the fundamentals are solid. Again, the path to getting there is not yet at all certain.
And if I would sum up one theme from all of us, it's implementation. We're all in our own ways talking about implementation, I think.
The only other thing I was going to add was just for those, and this may be information you already have, but I think it's relatively new. There are actually quite a few books that have come out, academic scholarly books, looking at the political economy of the energy transition, like actually looking at case studies. And so, this discussion that I think has also been a theme, if it interests you, I wish I could tell you off the top of my head. I can tell you where they are, but I have them at home, so I can certainly direct you. You can probably find them on your own. But again, that's a whole other topic, which I think we keep coming back to for a reason, that you can study and learn more about.
Yeah. So we're out of time here. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. Then also, please give a round of applause for our panelists. Mentioned at the beginning, this is part of the regular Career and Climate Action speaker series. Next week, we're also going to be talking around the same time on corporate sustainability. So if this is an issue of interest, please make sure to register next week. And then also please join us for dinner outside. Thanks.